So the Great Secrets of Israel, on the preface, in the preface on page 3, it states, of course, each time Israel was attacked, her people went to live among the Black people. This approach was justified by the predictions of Jewish prophets and confirmed by archaeology, genetic anthropology, and place names, makes it possible to recognize another aspect of the history of Israel, of its Jewish culture. Now, we want to go into the introduction, and the introduction starts on page 4 of the Great Secrets of Israel. And it states that on page 4, he talks about, in his introduction, Pastor Odimba, when he says that she is the daughter of his mother, talking about, let me go and get to that exact, I want to quote it. It says here, one moment, please. It says that when he says that she is the daughter of his mother, his sister, his beloved, and exhorted the ladies of Jerusalem by telling them that was where you came from, that was where your conception took place. He says this information could lead us to believe that the young ladies of Jerusalem were conceived by the Sulamite, hence the complexity of the text that renders its interpretation difficult. Even if we should take it as the expression of God's love for his people, the intervention of the young ladies of Jerusalem, the officer from the King's Guard Regiment, the friends and the invited guests do not seem to have any justifiable explanations and representation within divine counsel. Okay, so we want to look at this language, the ladies of Jerusalem, and this is another topic that we discuss here at Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute. We go into literary forms or figurative language that's used in the Hebrew Bible. And so we have to understand that, you know, when we're reading critically and analytically, we have to begin to recognize when figurative or literary forms are being used in the writing of the Bible. The scholars call the Bible a literary masterpiece because of the different the literary forms and the figurative language that is utilized to convey the message. And it's so when we look at the ladies of Jerusalem, we can see that this is a figure that's being put by personification. Things are being represented as persons. So often kingdoms and countries, this figure, this is where kingdoms, countries, and states, cities, and villages are spoken of as daughters or ladies. Yes, indeed. So, for example, you have the scripture references here. Please go and on your own time and study, look up these scriptures. The daughter of Tyre, the daughter of Babylon, towns and villages in the Hebrew means daughters. So a lot of times we miss the interpretation because we don't recognize that a figure is being utilized. Figurative language or literary forms. Figures are never used but for the sake of emphasis. They can never, therefore, be ignored. Ignorance of figures of speech has led to the grossest of errors, which have been caused either for taking literally what is figurative or from taking figuratively what is literal. So it is the truth which is literal, while the words employed are figurative. Also in the introduction on page 4, he says, Pastor Vanda Odimba says this, a very pertinent question arises. What was the major reason of writing the book during that era? And why was this text associated with and placed over and above, I misspelled and, I gotta go back, excuse me. with and placed over and above the sacred books of the Jewish canon. So again, when we're talking about looking at the era in which the book was written, we're considering the cultural context, going into analysis. And so we have to always remember and consider cultural context. Now, if we don't do that, we run the risk of going into this issue of anachronism or anachronistic thinking. And so anachronism is means ana, against time, right? Is a chronological inconsistency in some arrangement, especially a juxtaposition of people, events, objects, language, terms, and customs from different time periods. Okay. The most common type of anachronism is an object misplaced in time, but it may be a verbal expression, a technology, a philosophical idea, a musical style, a material, a plant or animal, a custom, or anything else associated with a particular period that is placed outside its proper temporal domain. An anachronism may be either intentional or unintentional. Intentional anachronisms may be introduced into a literary or artistic work to help a contemporary audience engage more readily with a historical period. Anachronism can also be used intentionally for purposes of rhetoric, propaganda, comedy, or shock. Unintentional anachronisms may occur when a writer, artist, or performer is unaware of differences in technology, terminology, and language, customs and attitudes, or even fashions between different historical periods and eras. And I would state that most of us are here in the unintentional anachronistic mindset because we don't have the literary development, literacy skills. And so in terms of language, we are not able to ascertain different historical periods and eras in our reading. The people who are doing this intentional anachronism or anachronistic thinking and writing would be the scholars, the exegetes, people like Hegel, the German philosopher, and the racist historians who intentionally, for the purposes of propaganda, intentionally introduce this anachronistic way of thinking into their interpretive process or their interpretive analysis. Now, so anachronism is something that is not in its context, that is not in its context, historical or chronological time. So here's an example of anachronism. This is the ancient Greek Orpheus with a violin here, invented in the 16th century rather than the lyre. So the question, however, persists, as he states, Pastor Vanda. In what circumstances was this book written, and what was the event that underscored the importance of writing this book to the extent that it has been associated with the sacred books of Israel? The translation of this book is hardly credible when approached from the Western or modern perspective. And I would say when approached from the anachronistic mindset or perspective. The Western or modern perspective. The translation, what, of the Book of Song of Solomon. Now, he goes on to state on page 5 in his introduction that it is worthy of note that Israel is a state that was politically formed by people from Egypt, Africa, 60 centuries before, and we want to emphasize before, 60 centuries before the birth of Greek and Roman civilizations, which later influenced the European culture. So the question is, how many years is 60 centuries? We're talking about 60 centuries before the birth of the Greek and Roman civilization. Okay, let that sink in. Now, this is a quote from his introduction. He quotes a scholar named Zohar, and he states that for Zohar, the Song of Songs constitutes the summary of the whole Bible and all the creation work, the summary of the mystery of the patriarchs, of the slavery in Egypt, and of the liberation of Israel, that of the canticles sung during the crossing of the Red Sea. It is the summary of the Decalogue and the theophany of the Sinai, and of all that took place in Israel during her sojourn in the desert until her arrival on the promised land. The Song of Songs contains all that took place and that will take place. Now, this was a very interesting statement made by this scholar Zohar, that can you imagine that all of this is if you read it rightly, if you read it according to the African genre of the Semitic Black people, the African palaver, and you're not reading it based on with using the Western or modern perspective. You're not reading it according to with an anachronistic thinking, that it entails all of this here. The Song of Songs, he says, constitutes the summary of the whole Bible. That's not how we were taught the Song of, when I would read it, the Song of Solomon. But this is what is in there. Now, so important, this is very important information. And we need to get this, He also states in this introduction on page 6, Pastor Odimba, quote, "We believe that the ancient Egyptians had resolved the problem of meaning in a very clear manner, and that the Greeks, their students, got confused when they tried to hide the origin of the discoveries made by the knowledgeable Africans, and therefore could not keep all the components of the solution found by the latter. The paradoxes expressed by Zenon, Plato, the Stoics, etc., are from this standpoint offshoots of the very elaborate theories of Black philosophers." You see what happens when you try to deceive? You get confused. They got confused because they were trying to deceive and hide the origin of their discoveries. What a web we weave when at first we try to deceive. That's what they used to tell us, the elders. Now, in his introduction on page 7, The Great Secrets of Israel, and this is a presentation brought to you by Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute, where we are reading critically as a righteous act, Identity Empowerment, The Great Secrets of Israel. Now, he goes on to state in his introduction, these are just highlights and points that I'm bringing out before we start the actual reading of the book. I wanted to bring out some of these very important points. In the introduction, he says that the issue of the separation of Joseph and his descendants from his brothers. Now we have to think about this. The issue of the separation, you know, we've read that story over and over again about Joseph and how his brothers sold him into slavery. Now, most of us can recite that story. We can summarize that story. We know that story like the back of our hand. We were taught that story since in Sunday school. But now it's time we're going to analyze. We're going to go into the analysis of the story of the separation of Joseph and his descendants from his brothers. The post-Solomon prophets have predicted the meeting between this two Jewish people in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 16 through 28. Isn't that interesting? To make that connection, that's a part of analysis, critical analysis, making connections within the text. Quote, it states, "Take a piece of wood and write on it for Judah and the children of Israel who were associated with him. Take another piece of wood and write on it for Joseph, Ephraim, and all the household of the children of Israel who were associated with him. Put them together to form one piece. Isn't that interesting? We've probably read this scripture in church and could never really break down, look at the two Jewish people right here in this chapter. Chapter 37, Ezekiel. Now look, he's going to go into discussing who are the Jews of Joseph. That's the question. Who are the Jews of Joseph? So he's identifying the Jews of Joseph and of Jacob and the Jews of Joseph and Judah. And before we can undertake to translate the book of Solomon, in order to understand, we have to know whom the post-Solomon prophets refer to as Judah and Joseph. Now, this important part of history of Israel was cut off because of the wave of extermination that was the lot of the Jews for 2,000 years by the formation of a modern movement of Judaism, which sought to modify the former one. So this is why this information was cut off, because of the extermination campaigns. Yes, the extermination campaigns, anti-Semitic campaigns done by, perpetrated by the enemies of Israel, the enemies of God, the enemies of God's people. And they're enemies because, as we will find out, they're enemies of the ideology of the Israelites, the ideology that's embedded and that is taught in the laws of God, in Torah. All right, so this is how it's broken down. This is how this book is broken down. The history of the Jews before Solomon, the history of the Jews after Solomon, and then the last section, section 3, will be the translation of the Songs of Solomon in accordance with the African palaver, which is the literary genre of the Semitic Black people of Africa. All right, and that's going to do it for this segment. Thank you for joining me, Operation Isaiah 58, again, Biblical Literacy Institute, where we are reading critically as a righteous act. How much better it is to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding, to be chosen than silver. Peace and blessings to all who love the truth, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Thank you for joining me. See you next time.